So good morning and welcome back to Facebook Live at Raisina. And this time around we are delighted to be joined by Admiral Girish Luthra, who's commanding the Western Naval Command out of Bombay. He has previously been in charge of the Southern Naval Command and he brings with him a plethora of experience, having also served in New Delhi where some of the key policy and strategic discussions take place in relation to defense. Good morning, sir, and welcome to this program. So, Indian Ocean.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir. So, the Indian Ocean is clearly a water body that is increasingly becoming important in global politics. And its adjoining cousins, both the Pacific and across Africa, the Atlantic, are increasingly seeing new contests, new conflicts, both around sovereignty, around freedom of navigation, and how countries are interpreting the freedom of navigation itself. So for the viewers, and many of them are who are just beginning to learn about this subject, I think it would be interesting if you could explain to us what is the Indian approach to freedom of navigation, how is it consistent with the laws and rules in place, and which are the countries we should be working with, or how should we be promoting this idea of the freedom of navigation itself.
As you rightly brought out, the salience of the Indian Ocean region and now the Indo-Pacific, which includes primarily the Western Pacific, has gone up significantly in the recent years, primarily because this is the growth underbelly of broader Asia. One of the issues that is under hot discussion for last few years is the issue of freedom of navigation. Everybody agrees to freedom of navigation. Everybody says that they are committed to freedom of navigation. But the issue is that interpretation of international maritime law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, interpretations vary and there are divergent positions. There are other issues where in many countries domestic maritime laws are not aligned to the UNCLOS. So therefore there are contradictions, and unless there is a common understanding of what is freedom of navigation, what it implies, there are bound to be challenges at sea, and therefore we are seeing more assertions, more freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs as the Americans call them, and we are seeing similar positions being taken by China to assert their point of view and their interpretation of freedom of navigation. On freedom of navigation, there is again broad consensus on as it applies to the trade and commerce, that is to merchant ships, but there is quite a bit of divergence when it comes to application as far as military vessels are concerned, particularly in areas in the territorial waters and in the exclusive economic zone, whether permission to transit is required, not required, whether exercises, maneuvers can be conducted, cannot be conducted. Similarly, for artificial islands, reefs, rocks, whether they are entitled to exclusive economic zone and therefore the maritime zones for each country. Now there are different interpretations because these issues have not been spelled out very clearly in the UNCLOS. So therefore I think there is a requirement to have a common understanding, and as the theme of this conference is multilateralism, and therefore for multilateralism to succeed, it is very important to have a common understanding on such international norms. As far as India is concerned, India has been abiding by, promoting, and very keen that all countries do likewise as far as international maritime law is concerned. You know that out of our 7 maritime neighbors, we have settled the maritime boundary with 6 maritime neighbors following the international maritime law. And we have gone by the arbitration process and we have accepted the judgment in regard to the...
Which is the deliberate dispute resolution process.
That's right.
Transparent and open.
And while the final decision may not have been entirely to the satisfaction of both the countries perhaps, but it was a decision that was accepted by all countries. But today you are watching that international courts, their decisions are also being turned down by some countries, which is again not something good from the point of view of multilateralism. And therefore we feel that a better understanding of international norms and a better interpretation, a clear understanding, common understanding is necessary to prevent issues related to freedom of navigation that are they have the potential of escalation if there is some misunderstanding.
So let me take you up on this itself. I think, like you mentioned, 6 of our neighbors have settled their maritime boundaries with us. I think many of those belong to the Bay of Bengal community. The government of India is looking at BIMSTEC and looking at the community quite closely now, since the western frontiers seem to be facing a logjam. Now, why is it difficult for 6 of us who have actually adhered to international law, have settled the boundaries, to come up with a normative framework and say that whoever wants to work in the Bay of Bengal community, whoever wants to engage with us, be it on commerce, be it on trade, be it on transit, should adhere to these normative frameworks? So, like the ASEAN created certain normative frameworks around their waters. Is it time for India to take like a leading role and creating an Indian Ocean Charter where we say these are democratic, transparent and open norms that 24 countries who form the littorals agree to?
I think instead of taking a regional or a sub-regional approach on this issue, I would recommend an international approach. As you know, UNCLOS took many years of deliberations and discussions to come about. Similarly, I'm not suggesting that this is going to be a simple process. It is a long-drawn process. It will be arduous, going through, trying to build consensus internationally. But I think it is better because in these areas, in addition to local and regional players who are present in the waters, there are countries, international players. As you know, in the IOR itself, we have more than 35 navies who are operating regularly. And therefore, these laws, I think, should not be restricted to a framework which is sub-regional or regional. It should be international. And in that process, India and countries who think likewise should take the lead and get this process going. And in due course, if we have a common understanding, I think it will strengthen maritime security at sea.
So, under the IONS process and under the Indian Ocean Rim Association process, are some of these key issues being discussed? Or are they more operational and tactical in nature?
IONS is more operational in nature, and IORA looks at issues which are more government to government at the political level. At IONS, we have discussed issues related to maritime security, issues related to piracy, issues related to building standard operating procedures, confidence building measures. So these issues are also important from the point of view of strengthening maritime security. But both IONS and IORA are making their significant contributions to strengthening maritime security. And in IONS, as you know, India had taken the lead and set up IONS with the help of many other countries. But the IONS chairpersonship passes on every 2 years to another country, and every 2 years there is somebody else who is in the chair, and that process is going on quite well.
Okay. So now, I think for many of us who don't necessarily understand defense and security like you do, the question that comes to mind is, does the Indian Navy have the capacity to be a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region? And what more needs to be done for India to become a provider of global security in the maritime domain?
The Indian Navy has been looking at our area of primary interest and our area of secondary interest. Now, some time back, our area of secondary interest, which used to be till Malacca Straits, was increased to include the Western Pacific, which is now our area of secondary interest. We have the assets to look after our primary area of interest and ensure stability and security in this region. Although I must add that the challenges in this region are increasing. As you know, a number of countries are now deploying their warships and their submarines in this area, and this trend is increasing. While you mentioned earlier Bay of Bengal and the focus on Bay of Bengal, but a number of submarine deployments are also taking place in the Arabian Sea, and therefore a number of naval forces being present in this area creates a set of challenges. But Indian Navy is prepared to look after India's interests, India's maritime interests in this area. But to be a net security provider in the region, that is Indian Ocean region, and subsequently, as you mentioned, to expand that framework to areas, to adjoining seas, adjoining oceans, and then gradually move beyond Indian Ocean, we will need more capacity additions.
Sir, let me give you a hypothetical example, which may not be hypothetical for too long. In the Indian Ocean itself, and perhaps in the Arabian Sea, which is currently what you face when you sit in office every day, you might, in the next 7 years or 5 years, have a situation where at least 3 or 4 aircraft carriers are operating with different flags. So 3 or 4 countries may have the capacity to operate aircraft carriers in that part of the woods. So Americans already present, India already operates one, the Chinese are not going to be far away, and once the British have 2 of their ships under construction on the waters, one of them might be sailing this side too. So, and these are proximate waters, these are very proximate waters, and unlike the rivalries of the Cold War, where the distance between Russia and America always meant navies were operating in distant operations. In this case, we are all going to be stepping on each other's toes. Is there a need for a new conversation among some of these naval powers, where confidence building measures, where certain navy to navy contact can be established, so that no undesired incident could be provoked because of these proximate operations?
There is already a process for prevention of such incidents, and a process where a common understanding is sought to be built up, again through the IONS process, and similarly through the WPNS, that is the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, through the WPNS process. A similar process is on for incident prevention, and to have better understanding where a number of naval forces are operating, and operating sometimes in close proximity. As you know, in the Gulf of Aden, where we have been doing anti-piracy operations for almost 8 years now, 9 years now, since September 2008. A large number of countries have been operating over there, and in a very constricted area, some operating under NATO grouping, some operating under another charter, many operating as independent deployers. But a coordination mechanism has been worked out through the shade mechanism, so that there is clear understanding of operations going on, and then there is no misunderstanding. So similar frameworks are possible in variety of areas, and I think as time goes by, more understanding between the navies and a better framework for that will be required, as we have done for anti-piracy operations.
So there is clearly a churn in the oceans, and there is a appreciation of the fact that mechanisms and frameworks need to be created, and India will eventually have to not only be a regional security provider, but expand to a global role. So with that, with those thoughts, let me thank Admiral Luthra for joining us both at the Raisina and at Facebook Live.